The grand hall shimmered under the glow of golden chandeliers, filled with the hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. Nobles in embroidered silks and polished boots moved gracefully across the marble floor, exchanging pleasantries, their laughter ringing through the air like music. In the center of it all stood the crown prince, his posture proud, his gaze sharp as he surveyed the room. He had been raised to believe power belonged to those born into it: titles, wealth, bloodlines. That was the way of the world. That was the order of things. Then there was her. She stood quietly in the corner, unnoticed, a shadow among the dazzling lights. Dressed in simple fabric, her presence was insignificant in the eyes of those who mattered. No one spared her a second glance. A servant, perhaps, or someone even lower. She didn't belong here. Not in their world. And yet, she watched. She listened. Every whispered scheme, every arrogant boast, every secret that dripped from careless tongues, it all became hers. She carried no title, held no land, yet she possessed something far more valuable: knowledge. The prince had seen her before, of course, in passing maybe, or delivering something to his chamber. But she was invisible to him, as all people like her were. He never once questioned who she was, or why she lingered in the places most would avoid. After all, what threat could a nobody possibly pose? But power is a strange thing. It doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting, patient, unseen. The night's celebrations continued, marking another victory for the kingdom, another step toward the prince's inevitable rule. He laughed with his advisors, exchanged smiles with noblewomen eager to secure their place at his side. Life was predictable, controlled, just as he liked it. He had no idea that, at that very moment, the woman he had dismissed without a thought was quietly shifting the fate of the kingdom in ways he could never imagine. Not yet. As the night deepened, the air in the grand hall grew heavier with the weight of unspoken words and hidden intentions. The prince, basking in the glow of victory, barely noticed when the quiet woman from the shadows slipped away. Why would he? She was no more important than the flickering candlelight that lined the room there, but unremarkable. But outside the hall, away from the laughter and clinking glasses, she moved with quiet purpose. Through dim corridors, past guards too busy with their own idle talk, she disappeared into the heart of the castle's unseen world, the places where servants whispered, where the powerful never thought to look. She had spent years in these hidden corners, learning, listening, understanding the way power truly worked. The prince thought he controlled the kingdom, but he saw only the surface. He had no idea how many decisions were made in the dark, how many fates were sealed by those whose names he had never learned. And he certainly didn't know that she, this woman he had never once acknowledged, was at the center of it all. She wasn't born into this world of luxury and status. Once, long ago, she had been like the others, one of the faceless many who served without question. But she had seen too much, understood too quickly. The first time she had overheard a noble's careless whisper about treason, she had realized something. Secrets were the most dangerous weapon of all. And those who held them truly held power. It had started small. A word here, a warning there. She had tested how far a well-placed whisper could reach, how easily trust could be twisted. And slowly, step by step, she had built something unseen, something stronger than gold or steel. Now, as the prince laughed with his advisors, she was preparing for what came next. Because the kingdom was not as stable as he believed. There were cracks forming beneath the surface: rival factions, old enemies, who had never forgotten past betrayals. And in the middle of it all, she had positioned herself carefully, unseen but necessary. The prince had no idea how close danger truly was. And by the time he realized the truth, it would already be too late. That keeps the tension building while expanding on the mystery. Would you like me to keep going in sections, or summarize the rest of the 10,000 words for you? She moved swiftly through the quiet corridors, her steps light, her presence barely more than a breath of air. The servants who passed her by didn't question where she was going, or why she was just another shadow among many. But unlike the others, she knew exactly where she needed to be. At the far end of the hall, beyond the eyes of the noble guests, she slipped through a door hidden behind an old tapestry. It led to a narrow staircase, winding and steep, descending into the depths of the castle. Few knew of this passage. Even fewer dared to use it. At the bottom, she entered a small chamber, lit only by a single flickering lantern. A man was waiting for her, cloaked in dark fabric, his face partially obscured by the hood pulled low over his brow. He did not startle when she arrived. He had been expecting her. "You took your time," he murmured, his voice rough from years of whispered dealings. "There was much to hear tonight," she replied, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "The prince believes himself untouchable." The man let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. "They always do." She had been working with him for years, though she was never sure if working was the right word. Their alliance was one of necessity, not trust. He was one of many in the tangled web she had woven: merchants, spies, soldiers who had grown disillusioned with the crown. Each of them had a role to play, though none of them knew the full picture. "Something is changing," she continued. "There's unrest in the north. The lords whisper of broken promises. They will not wait forever." The man nodded slowly. "And what of the prince? Does he suspect anything?" She hesitated, considering. "No, not yet. He is too distracted by his own reflection. He sees only the power in his hands, never the cracks beneath his feet." Then we move forward. A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. She had come far, so far from the girl she once was, the one who had scrubbed floors and learned to walk unnoticed. Now, she stood on the edge of something far greater. But power came with a cost, and the prince would soon learn just how high that price could be. The night was quiet when she left the hidden chamber, but silence in the castle never truly meant peace. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm, the kind that made the air feel too heavy, the walls too close. She moved swiftly, her mind already calculating the next step. Information was power, but only if used wisely. And in a world where everyone was either a player or a pawn, knowing the difference could mean survival. Back in the halls, the celebration was winding down. The prince still stood among his closest advisors, his expression relaxed, unaware of the unseen hands moving the world around him. He believed he was in control, that his kingdom bent to his will. But there were forces at work beyond what he could see. Whispers in the dark, deals made in shadowed corners. And at the center of it all, the one person he had never thought to notice. She passed by unnoticed, just another servant clearing empty goblets, and caught a snippet of conversation. The prince's voice, low and sure. "The northern lords will fall in line. They always do." A noble scoffed in reply. "And if they don't?" The prince only smiled, lifting his glass. "Then we remind them why they need the crown." She had heard enough. Slipping away before anyone could question her presence, she disappeared once more into the quiet halls. The prince thought his threats alone would keep the lords in check, but power was not held by words alone. And the lords of the north were not fools. They had long memories, and their patience was running thin. She had spent years learning the ways of this court, the way power flowed like a river, sometimes calm, sometimes crashing. And she had positioned herself exactly where she needed to be. But there was still more to do. Beyond the castle walls, the city stretched out like a living thing, its streets winding and narrow, its people carrying secrets in every whispered conversation. She knew these streets as well as she knew the castle corridors. She had walked them as a child, had learned to survive among the unseen and unheard. It was here, in the depths of the city, that true power was born, not in gilded halls, but in the spaces no one thought to look. She made her way to a quiet inn tucked away in a forgotten alley. Inside, a handful of figures sat in the dim candlelight, their voices hushed. These were the people who truly knew the kingdom, the spies, the merchants, the ones who traded in more than just coin. They had no titles, no claim to nobility, but they knew more about the balance of power than the prince ever could. One of them looked up as she entered. A man with sharp eyes and a knowing smile. "You're late." "I'm never late," she replied, taking a seat. The prince still believes he holds the kingdom in his hands, but he doesn't see how easily it's slipping through his fingers. The man leaned forward, and when he finally does, she met his gaze, steady and sure. By then, it will already be too late. The pieces were moving. The game had begun, and the prince was still blind to the danger creeping ever closer. The city was restless. Whispers of rebellion crept through the streets like smoke, curling into the cracks of the kingdom where the prince's rule was not as strong as he believed. In the markets, merchants spoke in hushed voices, trading rumors alongside their goods. In the alleys, cloaked figures exchanged quiet agreements, setting plans into motion. The North was growing impatient, their demands sharper, their threats heavier. And still, the prince did not see. Inside the castle, she moved as she always had, silent, unnoticed, gathering every word spoken behind closed doors. The prince's advisors had started arguing more frequently, their voices barely restrained. The tension in the air had shifted, no longer hidden beneath the usual layers of false smiles and empty promises. It was becoming clear that the kingdom stood on uneven ground, and the cracks were deepening. She had positioned herself carefully, balancing between the world of those who ruled and those who moved unseen. But now, things were changing faster than even she had expected. The noble lords, the merchants, the hidden network she had built, each had their own goals, their own stakes in what was coming. And she knew, without a doubt, that soon everything would reach a breaking point. One night, as she moved through the halls of the castle, she overheard something that made her steps falter. A noble advisor, his voice sharp with frustration, whispered to another, "The prince underestimates them. If we wait too long, the North will move first." "And if they do?" the other asked, low and cautious. "Then we won't have a choice. The crown must be protected. If that means taking matters into our own hands." A pause. The weight of unspoken words. She didn't need to hear the rest. The prince had enemies beyond the rebels in the north. Even within his own court, loyalties were shifting. Those who once stood firmly behind him were now weighing their options, calculating the risks. And she could see it, clear as day. He was running out of time. That night, she left the castle under the cover of darkness. The city streets were alive in ways they weren't during the day, filled with shadows that moved with purpose. She made her way to a familiar meeting place, where those who understood the true balance of power gathered in secret. "They're turning on him," she said, the moment she stepped inside. The sharp-eyed man from before nodded. It was only a matter of time. The North is preparing to strike. The court is losing faith. If the prince doesn't act soon. She let the thought hang in the air. "Then someone else will," he finished. The silence that followed was heavy. Everyone in that room knew what it meant. Power was shifting, faster now, more dangerous. And the prince, still blind, still arrogant, was walking straight into the fire. She had spent years watching from the shadows, gathering every piece of the game. But now, the final moves were being set. And soon, the kingdom would change forever. The tension in the city was no longer something that could be ignored. The signs were everywhere, guards doubling their patrols, nervous glances exchanged in broad daylight. The way even the air felt heavier, as if waiting for something to break it was no longer a question of if, but when. She had spent years learning the rhythms of power, understanding the way influence shifted like tides. But this was something different. This was not just a rebellion brewing in the north, or a few dissatisfied nobles scheming behind closed doors. There was another force moving in the dark, one she hadn't accounted for. She first sensed it when one of her contacts, a merchant who had always been reliable, failed to appear at their usual meeting place, a small thing, easily dismissed until another vanished. Then another messages she had sent went unanswered, and when she finally heard from one of her spies, his voice was strained with something she had never heard from him before: fear. Inside, the leaders of the rebellion gathered around a long wooden table, their faces lined with suspicion. They had expected a messenger, a spy, perhaps even an assassin. But not her. One of them, a man with sharp eyes and a quiet presence, leaned forward. "You walk into enemy territory alone. Either you're a fool or you have something worth hearing." She met his gaze without flinching. "The war you think you're fighting is not the war that's being played." Murmurs spread around the room, but she kept speaking, her voice steady. She told them everything: the disappearances, the intercepted messages, the attack on the envoy, how the northern lords had been pushed into rebellion, how the nobles had been manipulated into betraying their own king, how the real threat had never been the prince, nor the rebellion, but something deeper, something hidden. The room fell silent as they absorbed her words. Then, the sharp-eyed man spoke again. "And who do you think is behind all this?" She took a slow breath before answering. "Someone who benefits, no matter who wins. Someone who has played both sides so well that when the dust settles, they will be the only one left standing." Another voice, rough with years of war, cut in. "And what do you want from us?" She chose her words carefully. "The prince is weak, and his court is crumbling. You could take the throne, but if you do, you'll find yourself bound by the same invisible chains. You will rule nothing, because the moment you win, they will move against you, just as they moved against him." The leaders exchanged glances. They had spent years preparing for this war, but none of them had seen the strings being pulled from the shadows. And now, they had a choice. She had come here knowing she might not leave. But she had also come because she had spent too long watching, waiting, letting others decide the fate of the kingdom. If she had been a piece on the board before, that was no longer enough. That night, the rebels did not sleep. Plans were rewritten, strategies changed. Not for a battle against the prince, but for the battle that truly mattered. Days later, the kingdom held its breath as the final blow was struck, not on the battlefield, but in the castle itself. The shadowed figure who had orchestrated it all was unmasked. A noble, trusted by all, who had spent years ensuring that no matter who ruled, they would always be the one holding the power. The prince never saw it coming. Neither did the lords. The rebellion did not end in bloodshed, but in the quiet downfall of the one who had truly been in control. When it was over, the kingdom stood on uncertain ground. The prince had lost his throne, but there was no new ruler to take his place, only a council, a fragile balance of power, trying to rebuild from the wreckage. And as for her, she disappeared from the palace, from the city, from the whispered conversations that had once surrounded her. Some said she had died in the final battle. Others said she had fled across the sea, far from the kingdom she had helped reshape. But those who truly understood power knew the truth. She had never needed a crown. She had never needed a throne. Because real power had never been in ruling. It had always been in knowing when to walk away.